The spectacle of a modern democracy attempting to combat a microscopic enemy would have been comedy if it hadn't been so tragically bungled. Here we were, the most scientifically advanced civilization in human history, reduced to the medieval practice of hiding in our homes, while our leaders, those paragons of wisdom and foresight, issued contradictory edicts with the confidence of Oracle at Delphi and approximately the same accuracy rate. The pandemic didn't merely expose the virus, it exposed the viral incompetence of our institutions and the disturbing eagerness of populations to embrace either servile compliance or deranged rebellion, with precious little reasoned skepticism in between. Consider first the grotesque theater of government lockdowns, implemented with all the nuance of a sledgehammer performing brain surgery. Politicians who couldn't organize a successful birthday party suddenly appointed themselves supreme commanders of human movement, decreeing which businesses were essential, liquor stores, yes, bookshops, no, in decisions that revealed more about societal priorities than any sociology textbook ever could. The same authorities who assured us that 2 weeks would flatten the curve proceeded to extend their newfound powers with the grim determination of a dinner guest who won't take a hint. Meanwhile, the wealthy retreated to their country estates for what amounted to an extended sabbatical, posting Instagram photos of sourdough bread while the working class risked their lives delivering groceries to their doorsteps. Marie Antoinette would have admired the audacity. The vaccine mandates presented an even more exquisite moral pretzel. Here was a genuine scientific triumph. Vaccines developed at unprecedented speed, immediately transformed into a political football by all sides. On one flank stood the authoritarian cheerleaders, insisting that bodily autonomy was suddenly negotiable when it came to public health, conveniently forgetting their previous positions on that very principle. These were often the same individuals who had spent decades, correctly, defending a woman's right to choose, now pivoting to argue that choice was a luxury we couldn't afford. The irony was so thick you could have bottled it and sold it as a COVID cure to the conspiracy theorists. And what a bumper crop of conspiracy theorists we harvested. If the government's ham-fisted response was thesis, the anti-vaccine movement became its antithesis, and neither contained much synthesis of actual thought. Suddenly, every suburban Facebook warrior with a search engine became an immunologist, virologist, and statistician rolled into one. They spoke of doing their own research, which invariably meant watching YouTube videos produced by chiropractors and washed-up celebrities. The vaccines contained microchips, they declared, typed on smartphones that actually did track their every movement. They warned of DNA alteration while cheerfully consuming processed foods, whose ingredients they couldn't pronounce. They trusted veterinary ivermectin over human vaccines, apparently preferring their medical advice from the same sources that deworm horses. But before we dismiss these people as merely ignorant, we should acknowledge the spectacular own goals scored by our scientific institutions. The Centers for Disease Control, that bastion of public health guidance, changed its recommendations with the frequency of a teenager changing relationship statuses. Masks were useless, then essential, then useless outdoors, then essential again, then optional if you were vaccinated, then essential regardless. The 6-foot social distancing rule, presented as scientific gospel, turned out to have been essentially plucked from thin air. Laboratory leak theories were branded as racist conspiracy theories until they weren't. Natural immunity was dismissed until it was quietly acknowledged. Each reversal, rather than being presented as the normal evolution of understanding in a novel situation, was delivered with the same absolutist certainty as the previous contradictory position. The phrase, "follow the science," became a thought-terminating cliché, wielded not in the spirit of genuine scientific inquiry, but as a cudgel to silence dissent. Science, properly understood, is a method, not a deity. It thrives on skepticism, questioning, and debate. Yet during the pandemic, questioning official narratives was treated as heresy. Scientists who deviated from the approved script found themselves censored, deplatformed, and professionally destroyed. The Great Barrington Declaration, whether one agreed with it or not, represented legitimate scientific debate by credentialed epidemiologists. It was treated as dangerous misinformation. Meanwhile, the tech platforms that couldn't prevent the spread of flat Earth theories suddenly appointed themselves arbiters of complex medical truth. The erosion of institutional trust didn't begin with COVID, of course. It had been a long time coming, nurtured by decades of lies about everything from weapons of mass destruction to financial crashes that somehow only the wealthy survived unscathed. But the pandemic accelerated this erosion to warp speed. When the public watched officials who mandated lockdowns violating their own rules, attending dinner parties, getting haircuts, traveling for holidays, the message was clear. These rules are for thee, not for me. Governor Gavin Newsom's French laundry soiree did more to undermine public health messaging than 1,000 conspiracy theorists ever could. The pharmaceutical companies, meanwhile, those selfless servants of human well-being, made out like the bandits they've always been. Pfizer and Moderna executives became billionaires overnight while insisting their primary concern was public health. They demanded and received immunity from liability, then fought tooth and nail against sharing their vaccine formulas with developing nations. The same companies that had spent decades profiting from the opioid epidemic were suddenly transformed into heroes, their CEOs adorning magazine covers like saints of modern medicine. Anyone who pointed out their sordid history was accused of promoting vaccine hesitancy, as if skepticism of corporate power was suddenly verboten. Perhaps most depressing was the tribal polarization that infected every aspect of the pandemic response. Your position on masks, vaccines, and lockdowns became a political identity marker, a way of signaling which team you belonged to. Nuance died a swift death. You couldn't simultaneously believe that vaccines were generally effective while opposing mandates, or support voluntary masking while questioning cloth mask efficacy. The algorithm-driven discourse demanded absolute positions. You were either a grandma killer or a sheep, with no ground in between for those of us who preferred to think rather than genuflect. The media, that supposed watchdog of democracy, performed about as effectively as a screen door on a submarine. Rather than investigating, questioning, and informing, most outlets became stenographers for their preferred narrative. Left-leaning media treated every government restriction as sacred writ. Right-leaning media reflexively opposed everything, including sensible precautions. The concept of proportional response, that perhaps we could protect the vulnerable without shutting down society, that perhaps natural immunity deserved consideration alongside vaccines, that perhaps Sweden wasn't actually a hellscape despite its different approach, was too complex for the binary thinking that drives engagement metrics. What the pandemic ultimately revealed was not just our vulnerability to biological pathogens, but our susceptibility to intellectual ones. Fear, that most primitive emotion, overrode critical thinking on all sides. The fearful embraced authoritarianism with disturbing enthusiasm, ready to surrender freedoms that previous generations had died to secure. Others, fearing the loss of those freedoms, embraced denialism with equal fervor, refusing even sensible precautions out of reflexive opposition. Both responses were fundamentally anti-intellectual, replacing thought with feeling, evidence with ideology. The tragedy is that there were legitimate questions that deserved serious debate. What is the appropriate balance between collective safety and individual freedom? How do we weigh the psychological and economic costs of lockdowns against their epidemiological benefits? How do we maintain democratic accountability during emergencies? These questions were either ignored or answered with slogans rather than serious consideration. The cost-benefit analyses that should have guided policy were replaced by moral grandstanding and political posturing. As I write this, we're told the pandemic is over, though the virus continues to circulate and mutate with cheerful indifference to our declarations. The emergency powers have mostly been relinquished, though the precedent set will undoubtedly be invoked again. The trust that was shattered hasn't been rebuilt. It's simply been papered over with collective amnesia. We've learned nothing, prepared for nothing, and reformed nothing. The next crisis will find us equally unprepared, equally divided, and equally susceptible to manipulation by those who profit from chaos. The proper response to the pandemic should have been one of humble empiricism, acknowledging uncertainty, adapting to evidence, respecting individual agency while promoting collective responsibility. Instead, we got the worst of all worlds: authoritarian certainty based on shifting sands, institutional mendacity that fueled legitimate distrust, and a discourse that punished questioning while rewarding conformity or contrarianism. The virus may have killed millions, but the response killed something perhaps equally vital: the possibility of rational public discourse in the face of genuine crisis. That may prove to be the pandemic's most lasting legacy.